Welcome to another episode of Strange Planet. Let me just crib here from the back of this book, The Nature of Astrology. Our ancient ancestors recorded the rhythms of the sun, moon, planets, and stars, correlating these rhythms with weather, plant growth, and animal and human behaviors. From these early geocosmic recordings were born calendars, astronomy, and astrology. While astrology is now mostly viewed as subjective fortune-telling, Bruce Schofield argues that astrology is not only a practice, but also a science, specifically a form of system science, a set of techniques for mapping and analyzing self-organizing systems. Bruce Schofield holds a doctorate in geosciences from the University of Massachusetts, a master's degree in social sciences from Montclair University, and a degree in history from Rutgers. He's a member of the National Council for Geocosmic Research and president of the Professional Astrologers Alliance, and he is the author of 14 books. He lives in Amherst, Massachusetts, and again, this is the latest, The Nature of Astrology. Bruce Schofield, welcome to the program. How are you?
Thank you. A little cold, but other than that, all right.
We're hardy winter people, you and I.
It's the Northeast.
That's it. Um, let's a little bit of a history lesson here. Who were the first? Let's call them sky watchers. When was or let me be more precise. The first sky watchers who kept records.
Yeah, that was in Mesopotamia. I'd probably start with the Sumerians, but there's a succession of empires. But Babylon was kind of a center, an intellectual center. But probably goes back about 5,000 years. The actual records go back to about 4,000. I mean, what, really specific records like phases of Venus attached to omens, which would constitute a form of astrology, omen type astrology. Well, cookbook astrology, right?
Cookbook
Look
astrology.
up
Right, right.
Moon conjunct Venus, and you look it up and it says, oh, there'll be, a lot of women in your life. It might have been like 4,000 years ago, they'd see that and they would have, the queen had a fit or something.
um, Now that would have been recorded on cuneiform.
Yeah. And they survived. The cuneiform tablets are clay tablets, and the written language was pushed into the wet clay with a stylus, and then it was baked. And they have lasted for a very long time. They don't go away like paper.
So when we're talking Mesopotamia, there's the Fertile Crescent there. That's where the big agricultural revolution happened. So
Some people. I just read a book called "The Food Crisis in Prehistory,"
Yes.
and the guy argues that humans knew about agriculture for a long time. I mean, that wasn't really an invention. What happened was they overpopulated the place, depleted all the resources, and they had to go to it. And what he said was that they didn't really want to, because eating that meat from the big game, the megafauna, was so good, and they had to start eating these grains that they had to prepare for long periods of time and commit themselves. And he says, we're in one now, and the next, we're fighting off eating insects, growing insects and eating them. He says, 1,000 years from now, it'll be normal.
Right, right.
If we want to sustain those populations. Anyway, it's not astrology. It's just a little insight
But
into,
so,
you know,
but given that there was the agriculture, were they primarily concerned with, I guess, what is known as astrometeorology?
well, yeah, I more or less argue, one of the arguments in the book is that astrology should be looked at from a broad perspective. And it was traditionally divided into two sections, natural astrology and judicial astrology, which would be more about people. But the natural side would have to do with things like the tides and the weather. And of course, information is invaluable to people who are embarking on agricultural civilization, where you're no longer, wandering around following big herds. You're stuck in a place and you have to stay there, and you have to protect everything from invaders, and you have to store food in case of drought. So, knowledge of the seasons and the weather was crucial.
What were they using? Reflection pools as they did in Mesoamerica, or what were they using in Mesopotamia?
For what?
To look at the skies.
Oh, they had towers, and they had people up there with sighting instruments, no doubt. They had essentially a college of sky watchers, and then they would record what was going on in the sky, and also record what was going on in the kingdom, and look for correlations.
So, in terms of the astrometeorology we're talking about, Can you give me an example, maybe something, an important connection these early astrologers were able to make that were important to agriculture or even basic survival? In
Well,
other words, in order to they could forecast now.
well, certainly forecasting the seasons is crucial. And there may be other rhythms particular to a certain area, like, the flooding of the Nile in Egypt was timed by the heliacal rising of Sirius. But there may have been other weather patterns that were observed. Mesopotamia is very erratic and unstable weather-wise, so rains would be important, maybe predicting rains. And you see in the writings of the Arab astrologers in the medieval period, they were very concerned with predicting rains. And I mean, their writings survive. It's hard for me to test it out here in New England, but and I don't know that anybody has tested it out, given the weather records that we now have available.
The almanacs, were they based on astrology?
Yeah, that's how people got their weather forecast. They would buy an almanac for the year ahead, and that tradition was continued. I mean, we have almanacs out today, but I think nearly none of them, except with a few exceptions that are connected with astrology publications, like Llewellyn puts out the moon sign book, and they actually have an astrologer write up the forecast. But the other ones, in New England, we have the Old Farmer's Almanac, and there are a few others, and they've kind of given up on the astrology, and they use National Weather Service information, and they have their special formula, like when the phases of the moon occur and where they're located relative to the horizon, which some astrologer several hundred years ago probably put together. And he had his own almanac, and he just kept it private, but it's leaked out, and you can find it on the internet. But
And
they don't even use that anymore in most cases, and they don't want to talk to you about it. I've called up these places. They don't want to talk about what they do. That's part of their appeal. It's a mysterious way that they predict weather. And you know what? Their record is horrible.
yeah, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. So, what about the Greeks and their knowledge of geometry? How did they use that to advance astrology?
Well, they picked up on Babylonian, Mesopotamian omen astrology, and they put it into some kind of form. They were big on geometry, and when you look at a birth astrological chart today, it's basically a 360-degree graph of what was going on in the sky at a particular location at a particular time. But there's a deeper question in your question, and I think was astrology invented by a single genius, or was it something that came together out of over time, or was it a committee, or what? Because there was this transition in the centuries, BC, probably somewhere around 300, BCE, where Greek geometry and astrology, Babylonian astrology, had been mixed, and people were starting to write books on it. Now, the first quote unquote horoscope we have goes back to, I think, 410. But somewhere around there, something got put together. And it was at a time when the Greeks were pretty much at their height with philosophy and science, and Alexander had opened up all the by conquering Mesopotamia and all the way into India, he opened up the floodgates for the transfer of information both ways.
Oh, the Hindu school or tradition of astrology, did they begin the birth charts? Was that their thing?
Now,
No.
as my understanding of it is that in the Vedas there are references to moon cycles, but what might be called horoscopic astrology, birth charts, kind of came in with the Greeks.
Ah. So was there a distinction back then, like Pythagoras, for example? Would he have been considered an astrologer, a mathematician? Was it all the same?
Well, Pythagoras was a philosopher, and he was early. I mean, he goes back with the pre-Socratics in the 5th century, and I think that he speculated on the nature of the cosmos. You could say that he was a bit of a cosmologist. And he certainly was a mathematician. He, famous for the Pythagorean theorem, which you probably got from the Egyptians. But I wouldn't call him an astrologer.
During the Renaissance, though, wasn't the word for mathematician and astrologer basically the same?
Yeah, mathematici. Well, that. It was like that for a long time. I believe astrologers referred to mathematicians even in Rome. I'm pretty sure about that, because they had to do the math. That was a big challenge for doing astrology. You had to calculate the horoscope. Now, the word horoscope, Greek word, means view of the hour, and it refers to the ascendant. And from the ascendant, everything else like the midheaven and the houses would be constructed. So calculating that turns out to be very complex and required the development of a different kind of geometry. It required spherical geometry and eventually trigonometry. And that was worked on for a very long time. And the best minds around were engaged in that process. And it finally came together around the time of the Renaissance. And at that point, with trigonometry pretty much done and computations being facilitated by the development of logarithms, which are based on the findings of spherical trigonometry, the astrologers didn't need to be great mathematicians anymore. So the mathematicians went elsewhere. They went into, astronomy.
Well, that was my next question.
Astronomy, physics, and engineering, basically.
When was there like a schism, like a moment when they went their separate ways, or was it always thus? There was astronomy, there was astrology.
No, they were pretty much in the same loop. A lot of the same people did both. You take somebody like Kepler, great mathematician, great, astronomer, great astrologer. He kind of combined it all. He's one of the last that did that. But he was frustrated about it. If you read some of his writings, and they're almost always taken out of context by the skeptics, he said, why do I want to be reading horoscopes to these stupid people that don't learn anything? They'd understand the nuances in an astrological forecast. It's just a waste of time. So, there's that too. It got, when astrology was connected with a patron for a long time, or there were the intellectuals that were in the universities or in the monasteries. Right? So there was institutional support. Then you got the printing press, and then you had astrologers able to break free from a patronage system and publish their own almanacs, which is back then the equivalent of putting up your own website. And they got out of control and basically trashed the field with crazy predictions, and that didn't help either. The downfall of astrology, I discussed that in the whole central section of the book. The book is in 3 big sections. Each one's like a book itself. But the middle section is concerned with how astrology, fell in the gutter, basically.
The Mesoamerican astrologers or sky watchers,
Yeah.
would it be fair to say they had a particular interest or they placed a particular emphasis on Venus?
Well, yeah, Venus is the 3rd brightest object in the sky after the sun and moon. And it has some interesting behavior. First, it shows up as a morning star, and then it's an evening star, and then it reverses. And in between, it disappears for a while. The first records we have, real records of planetary positions and omens in Mesopotamia, go back to about, I think, about 1800 BCE, the Amisaduga tablets. And they're very similar to what the Maya were doing, about 1,500 years ago. So it would seem that if you're a sky watching society, you watch the sun and you get the seasons, you watch the moon, you get the tides, and maybe some, biological things happening. And then you look at Venus and you try to figure that out. Now, we have a pretty good idea that both cultures divided the astrological nature of Venus into 2 parts, morning star and evening star, although Mesopotamian records are not as clear about that as the Mayan records, which show 4 distinct stages, and they break them off. They relate them to the cycle of the moon. It's a little more complicated. But both cultures were essentially focusing on Venus early on.
And what was it telling them? I mean, again, were the Mesoamericans, were they more into astrometeorology?
Well, that was part of it too. But I think with Venus, it was more about social regulation. And John Carlson wrote a book, who's an archaeoastronomer, wrote a book called Venus and War. I'm trying to think what the title is, but it's basically connected with Venus Regulated Warfare is the title. It's a monograph. And it's about how the phases of Venus were not only interpreted by the Maya as correlating with big changes in social behavior, particularly wars, but they were also chosen as times for acting on things like that. So, that's, from the standpoint of an anthropologist, that's doesn't necessarily prove astrology, except that it's a useful way of organizing social behavior. From the standpoint of an astrologer, there's something else going on as well. There's some deep rhythm that humans are hooking into.
Bruce, we're going to take a quick time out. We'll come back and continue to discuss the book, The Nature of Astrology, and we'll tell you how to get a copy. Stay with us. What would it feel like to reclaim your health, your vitality, to sleep deeply, to live fully, to address health at the root, at the cellular level, so that your body can detect damage where you have it? Imagine living younger, longer, having the energy to do what you want to do when you want to do it. Discomfort fading away. ASEA Redox Supplement harnesses the power of your body to heal itself, giving you the ability to power your potential. This is one of the most profound health, athletic, and anti-aging discoveries of our lifetime, and we need the world to know about it. If you want to learn more about ASEA, visit strangeplanet.teamasea.com, strangeplanet.teamasea.com, and be sure to text or call my colleague and friend Lynn at 443-254-6024, 443-254-6024 to order or for additional information. ASEA Redox Supplement. It's truly wellness redefined. We are back with Bruce Schofield. One of the things that you kind of emphasize again and again in the book, The Nature of Astrology, History, Philosophy, and the Science of Self-Organizing Systems, is just that the subject matter of astrology is self-organizing systems. What do we mean by a self-organizing system, first of all?
Well, it's a phenomenon in nature. We have things like rocks and radiation and gases moving around, but we also have things like life, where there's an existence that is kind of an emergent phenomena out of all the elements that make it up, and it's self-sustaining. I think one of the most important things is that it slows down entropy. In other words, it breaks kind of the rules of physics. Well, it doesn't break them, it just slows them down. So you have things like life, and you have cell, you have organisms, more complex organisms, multicellular like us. We also have natural systems like the weather system and the climate system, and short-term systems like a hurricane, or very short-term systems like a tornado, where there's action going on. The feedback loops are recursive. They're going back into themselves, and they're self-sustaining as long as they can get some energy. And that's what we do. We get some energy. We eat food, and the food that we eat ultimately comes from the sun. Sun is where the plants get photons to make to photosynthesize and make glucose, basically. And then we either eat them or we eat animals that eat the plants, or a chain of events that way. But that's where we're living off solar energy in one form or another. And so we can sustain ourselves for a very long period of time. So we're a system. But astrology, does map these things out. We know that there is a medical astrology that maps out the condition of the body. And we know there's an astrometeorology, which maps out the behavior of the weather in various regions. And, we could say there's an astroclimatology too, but that's a little more complex. But astrology also maps out things like um, personality, and it maps out things like the behavior of groups.
Astroanthropology, astropsychology.
Maybe, yeah, certainly astropsychology. But what I point to in my book, and this is certainly not my idea by any means, this is an idea that's being developed by sociologists and um, system scientists in various disciplines, is that the idea that the brain activity itself has an emergent feature, and that's the coordination of all the impulses and activity in the nervous system develops into a consciousness and then focuses on a personality, on a set of characteristics of behavior that's pretty much consistent, and that groups of entities, organisms that are able to produce these emergent minds then form some kind of collective, which itself has a individual properties. Like you can have a nation state, and what's interesting is that there's a national character that is able to survive, the lifespans of generation after generation. So if a nation state came together sometime long ago, 1,000 years ago, and it was shaped in a certain way by certain conditions, and it developed a set of behaviors and attitudes, it could be perpetuated, for 1,000 years by people, being, participating in it. So there's a kind of, it's a sustained system.
Is that what you call quorum sensing?
Well, quorum sensing, yeah, in a way. Quorum sensing is when you have enough organisms to trigger an emergent property. And microbiologists study that because they see, when, say a certain kind of bacteria begins to glow, it has some luciferase in it, and you have to have enough of them, and then suddenly they're all doing it, or a flock of birds all tuned into each other, or a bunch of human beings in a punk rock concert in a mosh pit suddenly becoming coordinated in some bizarre way. I have a nephew who's a physicist that actually studies that as an emergent phenomena. I guess he likes to go to those concerts.
If you were going to do a projection on, a particular nation state and how it may be, or what its future is economically, or I don't know, whatever, geopolitically, how is that done? Is that basically a birth chart for the country?
Well, it's tricky. We have ongoing debates about the birth charts for various countries. There are charters and times when rulership changes. In the U.S., there's this Declaration of Independence, and there's an ongoing argument as to what chart works. I think astrologers tend to get too hung up in the technique of what I call a time slice, the astrological chart. That's the most popular technique. You draw a circular graph for a moment in time slice, and then you work with that. But I think there are other ways to do it. Sensitive degrees. You can notice that, for example, in the United States, I've been noticing for many years that 14 degrees of the mutable signs is very hot, right around those degrees. Now, it turns out that that's the ascendant for like a roughly 5 p.m. 4th of July chart, but it might be something else. Some countries change over time. They have different agreements with other countries, and maybe some of these degrees repeat over and over again. They become embedded in the national psyche. I'm reading a little more about Russia lately, and that's an interesting history of a lot of changes, but there are certain patterns that are certainly consistent.
Let's talk about your entree into astrology. My understanding is you started in your late teens, maybe 18, 19, young adulthood, let's say.
Yeah. Yep.
You had some people in your immediate circle, maybe some girlfriends, and they all had the same?
Yeah, I had this girlfriend. My first real serious girlfriend was born October 10th. And my best friend in high school was born October 11th. And, and so I didn't think too much of it. I mean, I was into science as a kid. But when I got into college, I then had another relationship with a woman born October 10th. And these are both, multi-year relationships. And my best friend in college was born October 9th. And then I had another birthday at October 10th, another girlfriend I went out with for a while. And I thought, and she, she knew something about astrology. And I started looking at this, and I found it to be a lot more complex than I was led to believe by the people that, wrote off astrology as a pseudoscience. And I kind of dug into it. And today, after a long life, I'm married to a woman born on October 11th. So
My
keep it
twin
coming back.
boys. My twin
What's
boys.
that?
I have twin boys,
Yeah.
16 years old, October 10th.
Oh, there you go.
Born 10 minutes, well, the first one was born 10 minutes after 10 on October
So do
10th.
you see the difference between them with their angles?
Um, well, they're night and day. I mean, they're fraternal, they're night and day. So,
Oh, yeah. Well, and then, 10 minutes apart, that means that's like 2.5 years by solar arc on the midheaven.
oh, wow. Interesting.
So that one could get, solar arc midheaven opposite Saturn at one point, maybe possibly during a time of crucial imprint vulnerability. And the other one could get it 2.5 later, and it makes no dent on them. So
Fascinating.
that's something you have to watch when you're dealing with twins.
You got to watch everything when you're dealing with
Yeah.
twins.
Well, yeah. You have your hands full.
Back in
I
the,
only had one boy, and that was tough. Aries moon.
he's an Aries.
Well, now he's a Libra, but he's got an Aries moon, and I think that says a lot.
All right. We'll take another time out. Bruce Schofield stays with us. Don't go away. What would it feel like to reclaim your health, your vitality, to sleep deeply, to live fully, to address health at the root, at the cellular level, so that your body can detect damage where you have it? Imagine living younger, longer, having the energy to do what you want to do when you want to do it. Discomfort fading away. ASEA Redox Supplement harnesses the power of your body to heal itself, giving you the ability to power your potential. This is one of the most profound health, athletic, and anti-aging discoveries of our lifetime, and we need the world to know about it. If you want to learn more about ASEA, visit strangeplanet.teamasea.com, strangeplanet.teamasea.com, and be sure to text or call my colleague and friend Lynn at 443-254-6024, 443-254-6024 to order or for additional information. ASEA Redox Supplement. It's truly wellness redefined. Bruce Schofield is with us. The Nature of Astrology, History, Philosophy, and the Science of Self-Organizing Systems. There it is right there. Get the glare off of that. How do we get a copy, Bruce?
We could order it from Inner Traditions, the publisher, and they sell it there, but you can buy it at any other place that sells books, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, anywhere they have it. But the publisher is Inner Traditions. They're in Vermont.
Saturn. You did a study for your PhD on Saturn.
I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I basically looked at Kepler's writings on, astrology, and he was big on the idea of Saturn affecting the weather when it was an aspect to the sun. And so my PhD proposal was, okay, I'm going to test it. No one had ever done that before. So I got weather records, and I went at it and wrote it all up for a thesis. And my advisors were a couple of them were really bothered by it that I got results, because I did all sorts of controls. And the worst thing was when you do it with Saturn and you get this, the temperature declines around the time that the sun is opposite Saturn from a geocentric point of view. And it's pretty consistent. And if you stack them all up over the length of the weather records, it's there. But for one of my controls, I did it with Jupiter, which is even more gravity, right?
Mm.
But I didn't get that effect. On the other hand, I got higher precipitation. So that's a real, that's a problem. What are we going to do with this? And my advisors, a couple of them were a little troubled by it. I was one of them. One of them said I was doing voodoo meteorology. He was joking. They were all good guys, but it was such an unusual PhD thesis. And one of my original members of the committee quit because he's actually a very big deal in the climate change world. You ever hear of the hockey stick?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, right. The graph. He was one of the three guys that did that, and he was on my committee. And he
Michael
told me,
Mann.
I can't support you. You're never going to get a grant, and we need money in this department. He was the head of the department,
Michael Mann.
and I totally understood. But my advisor was, she was very interested in stirring up the status quo. So she liked what I was doing. She didn't know anything about astrology, but she just liked what I was doing.
Jupiter and Saturn.
What's that?
I wanted to ask you about Jupiter and Saturn because there's some question as to whether they even orbit our sun or whether there's something else out there that they actually.
Well, there's the Barry Center. There's the center of mass of the solar system. So whenever you have a multiple body system, and it starts organizing itself, right? It's become self-organizing because it is, after all, the solar system, right? So it organizes itself, and the planets are substantial. Jupiter's pretty powerful, and Venus is close enough to the sun, and Earth is close enough to have some kind of effect. And so what happens is that over time, the actual center of mass of the solar system moves outside of the body of the sun. And so what you really see there is what's called the Barry Center, and all the objects in the solar system, including the sun, are moving around it. Although a lot of the time that Barry Center is within the surface of the sun, but it can move outside as far as one solar diameter.
Does that further complicate astrological charts? And
not for most people. I mean, I think if you're doing heliocentric astrology, it's useful knowledge, and it's exactly how a large number of exoplanets have been discovered. They call it the radial velocity method, but they look for variations, movements of the star itself, and then from that they can compute how big the bodies are that are orbiting around it. So it's a real thing. Yeah.
Wow. I'm jumping around here a little bit, but time is tight, and I want to cover as much ground as I can. I wanted to ask you the subject of lunacy, somewhat controversial, and the full moon and behavior. Where are you with this ongoing investigation, shall we say?
Well, you could find papers that show a correlation between the full moon and behavior, like births and trouble, police records, and then you can find studies that are going to show no correlation at all. So it's kind of a big mess right now. And there are a lot of people that are very determined to show that the moon has no effect on people. But I have noticed over the course of my life that when there's a process going on, usually a multi-day process, it'll often be brought together right around the time of the full moon. And you see that if you follow politics. Whenever there's some kind of big battle going on between parties, that happens to last maybe a week or so, as soon as the full moon comes in, usually within a few hours of that, they reach some kind of conclusion. So I think that when human systems are in a vulnerable state, they're hypersensitive to things like that.
Well, the election of the U.S. Speaker of the House took about a week.
And that occurred right after the full moon.
There you go. Go. Conjunctions. We had Jupiter, Saturn, and I think Pluto.
Pluto, yeah.
In 2020.
Yeah, big deal.
Often ushering in some sort of a black swan event. Well, we had one of those in 2020.
Yeah. Well, it happened, when the Protestant Reformation began, and Cortez defeated the Aztecs. And that was pretty big stuff there. And other times in history, you got, big disturbances too. It was in Capricorn, so it had a lot to do with government control. And one of the things I always talked about, I was asked to speak on it a few times, and I thought that, really what this signified was, a few years of grappling with authoritarianism and government control over people. And that could be precipitated by any number of things, wars, natural disasters, epidemics. I think that if somebody was paying me, if I had a full-time job and I was getting, say, 75,000 a year, US dollars, and my job was to really look at these things and, try to hone my predictions, I think I could have called it, because I would have had enough time to, look at, study virology. I knew a little bit about it, and I knew, I had read Plagues and People by O'Neill, which is a great book on plagues. And one of the things he ends with, he says, hey, we got to look at the influenza. It's highly communicative. It's going to cause a problem at some point. So if I had all that information in my head and the time to do it, and I didn't have to worry about other things, like taking care of things, I think that was kind of a no-brainer. But astrologers, you got to read horoscopes for people, charts for people, and you got to hustle, and it's not an easy job. You just can't go out and look in the online or in the in the old days in the paper for a job being an astrologer. We're just getting some schools where you can get certifications, or
Right.
you know something like that.
Well, a degree in history from Rutgers doesn't help either. Doesn't hurt, rather.
No,
Doesn't.
I went to college not to get a job. I went to college to figure out what's going on. My big question in life is like, what's reality? So I'm perfect for your show, right?
Absolutely.
Reality.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm interested in philosophy. Philosophy was my minor. History is if you want to really understand what's going on, you got to start with history.
Yeah.
You got to know some science. So I basically studied history, and then for my master's, I studied a lot of social science, anthropology, but I focused on history of science. And then I did the PhD, and I did it in geosciences, but I worked for a microbiologist and evolutionist. And I taught in the geosciences department, the biology department, and one semester in the astronomy department. So I was all over the map.
I want to ask you about Mars now. Sorry, Mercury. Mercury. Why does everything bad get blamed on, oh, Mercury's in retrograde? Like, explain that. What does that mean?
Well, when Mercury, well, it's a phenomena that occurs because Mercury's orbits within the Earth's orbit around the sun, and there are times when they're positioned in such a way that from the Earth, it looks like Mercury's going backwards, but it's not really going backwards.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of buzz about that, that things go wrong. And a lot of times they do, right when Mercury kind of stops in its motion and goes backwards, or stops in its motion and goes forwards again. Those 2 points are kind of volatile. And you'll actually see weather events, usually often wind events around those times, and certain times at certain parts of the Earth, obviously not everywhere. And you'll find a lot of things don't really go so well. I mean, the general rule that astrologers talk about is that when Mercury's retrograde, just go over things you've already done. Don't start anything new, which I think is really good advice. No one, to my knowledge, has actually measured Mercury retrograde as a phenomena because it's hard to attach units to what it does. I mean, that's the big problem with astrology. You can't do science with it very easily because you have to have units to do science, unless it's just observational field studies. And I think, one of the points I make in my book is that, what astrologers do is not that different from field biologists out there with binoculars looking at what an animal's doing. I study squirrels in my backyard and I learn a lot from it. And I consider that scientific because I make notes and I see what they're doing.
Are the effects of the planets, are they being muted because of either light pollution? I mean, that makes it more difficult to observe, but the effects down here on Earth, other things like electronic smog, like radio waves and all that, is that does
Yeah,
that
the electrical wiring.
dampening the effects?
Yeah, I don't, it may be. Gauquelin thought that his study of multiple studies of births and heredity and so on, personality, he thought that that the intervention of say a C-section messed up the scores that he was getting. So that may be a factor. Other people think that, because, and we're kind of electrical beings in many ways, being around all these wires that are on our walls and looking at, cathode ray tubes, might be disturbing. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, certainly if astrology is based on electromagnetism, there's got to be an effect. But I don't know that astrology is based on electromagnetism. What I say in the book is that there may be multiple causes for different kinds of astrology, but they tend to all obey the same rules. That's why you can do a birth chart for weather and a birth chart for a person and a birth chart for the stock market.
What's the next big conjunction we're looking at?
Well, there's Saturn Neptune coming up in a couple years. That should be pretty interesting. Neptune's been in Pisces for a long time now. I guess that's 7-8 years or so. And I've seen it as correlating with an increase in the amount of nonsense and so-called fake news. When the fake news are calling the real news the fake news, that's Neptune in Pisces. Saturn's I think, gonna be like the Grim Reaper. He's gonna come in and clean a lot of this stuff up, and a lot of people are not gonna like it. And so we're gonna move into that this year when Saturn enters Pisces, but the actual conjunction, I believe, comes in a couple of years. So, I mean, humans have overpopulated the planet. Most of us are insanely anthropocentric. And most of us are thinking short term. And the reason why is because, we've been civilized for only a very short period of time. We've been domesticated primates for 50,000 years or so, and that would be a high figure. But we just haven't had time to really adjust to everything we've created from agriculture on. So we're a little crazy. And the reality is that we're messing up the world. I mean, we're soiling our nest on a scale that we've never seen before. And I just think with Saturn coming over Neptune, it's going to be, coming to terms with what's really going on. I mean, you could see what's happening with climate change already. It's just like one disaster after another. And, we have a lot of people that are pushing out a lot of baloney about it. And I think the Saturn Neptune will, kind of slow that down, if not stop it in many cases. But when that happens, it's not going to be that good. We have a lot of cleanup to do and a lot of reconciliation with reality. The reality that we cannot sustain a lot of things that we do, including that anthropocentrism I just talked about. And astrologers are guilty of that too. It's all about people. And that's one of the things that I try to point out in my book. It's the nature of astrology. I mean, like, astrology is looking at nature as a whole. We're like, a very sophisticated monkey, ape, really. Other animals do things. I mean, there's tool using animals. So absolutely, we're like an order of magnitude greater than them in terms of the development of mind and language and communication. But, in the larger scheme of things, it's, we're still megafauna living on this planet with all these other things. And if we don't watch what we're doing, we're just going to make it worse for us. We've already made it worse for ourselves. So, yeah, Saturn, Neptune, that's, the Grim Reaper comes to town and says, hey, pay up.
On that happy note.
I'm bringing bad news. And, we have Pluto in Aquarius, and we can look at that as put a positive spin on that and say that, yeah, maybe there'll be some innovations. We'll have some great technological breakthroughs, and we might be able to fix a lot of our problems. It's not all doom and gloom, but I do think with Saturn, Neptune, it's reconciliation with reality. With Pluto and Aquarius, it's the opportunity to innovate our way out of it.
All right, go Pluto.
And I think that will accelerate when Uranus goes into Gemini.
All right, I'm betting on Pluto. All right, The Nature of Astrology. Once again, Bruce, how do we get a copy?
Inner Traditions, they have a website. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, most other places to sell books. I
Bruce?
saw it on eBay the other day.
Oh, terrific. All right. Great
Full
pleasure.
price.
Nice to meet you. Thank
Same
you.
here.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Subscribe at strangeplanetpodcast.com.